All right, so this is the Rapid Access Cloud dashboard where we can manage all of our projects and instances. So for this tutorial, we'll just be working under the project that's associated with our Alberta email address. The first step we have to do is create a key pair so that we can authenticate and access our instance. When we create a key pair, the public key is going to be stored on the server, and our browser will download the private key to our machine. To do this, we just navigate to the Key Pairs tab on the left-hand side here, and then click Create Key Pair. So we'll just give it some sort of meaningful name and then create it to download it. And it's important that you should save or move this file to somewhere that you'll remember it, because the key is not recoverable. So if you delete it or lose it, then you're going to lose access to your instance. So I'm just going to move my key from my downloads file to my default SSH file that holds all my other keys. And so the last step we have to do here is, if you're using a Mac OS or a Linux machine, we need to make sure that the key has the correct permissions. And so we can do that by just running sudo chmod 600 and then the path to our key. And that just makes sure that we're able to use the key when we want to access our instance. And so if you're on a Windows machine, then you shouldn't have to worry about that last step. Now that we have our key pair set up, we need to set up some security group for our project. So you can think of that as kind of a firewall for the instances, where any requests to the instance that don't match your security rules are going to be denied. And so we need to set up some basic rules to give us access to our instance. So we're going to navigate to the Network tab here, and then to Security Groups. And then we're going to manage the rules for our default security group. And ultimately, what we're going to want to do is add new rules for ICMP, SSH, HTTP, and HTTPS to give us access to our instance from any IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. So there's a lot more information about what all this means in the slides, but we'll quickly run through it here. So we're going to go ahead and go Add New Rule. And first we'll select for our rule SSH. And now we need to specify what IP addresses we want this rule to apply to. And so we're going to do that using this CIDR notation here, which again you can learn a little more about in the tutorial slides. But basically this notation where we have 0.0.0.0/0 is essentially giving the rule a wildcard to match all IPv4 addresses. So by adding this rule, we're allowing any IPv4 address to access port 22 of our instance, which is the default SSH port, if they have the key. So we'll go ahead and add this rule. And you can see that we now have a new ingress security rule for IPv4 to port 22 for SSH for all IPv4 addresses. And so we're going to want to do the same, but now for IPv6. And so for IPv6 addresses, we can shorten it by replacing all of the consecutive 0 hextets with 2 colons. So for this, our wildcard rule just becomes ::/0. And so now we've added these 2 rules, which will allow any IPv4 or IPv6 address to be able to SSH into this instance. And we're going to want to repeat this same process again. Go all ICMP for all IPv4. All ICMP for IPv6. Then HTTP for IPv4. And again, you can see it automatically selects the port range for the default 80 for HTTP. And then HTTP for IPv6. And then finally HTTPS for IPv4 and IPv6. And so then when you're done, your new default security group should look something like this, where we have our ICMP rules, our SSH rules, and the HTTP and HTTPS. Okay, so now that we've got our key pairs and security groups set up, the next step is to actually set up our instance. And the instance is just a virtual machine that's running on the Rapid Access Cloud. So we'll go back up to Compute, and then to the Instances tab. And then we'll go ahead and click Launch Instance. So again, we'll give it some sort of meaningful name, and then we'll select the flavor. And the flavor is just a template that defines how many virtual CPUs and RAM, disk space, etc. that the instance will have. And so for the demo, I'm just going to go ahead and click the M1 micro. And then we'll select boot from image for our source. And for the image, we can just pick the Ubuntu 18.04 one here. And now we have to set up the access and security rules for this instance. So we'll go to the Access and Security tab here, and then select the key pair that we created earlier, and then make sure that we click the default security group that we just finished setting up. And then we can go ahead and press Launch to launch the instance. So after a few minutes, you should see that your instance is now set up and running. And it should have two IP addresses, an IPv4 and an IPv6. So this IPv6 address is the default way that you're going to access your instance, and the IPv4 is an internal private IP that isn't publicly routable. So in order to connect to this IPv6 address, you need to have IPv6 internet access. So what you need to do now is determine if you do or not. And you can easily do this by just Googling, do I have IPv6? And a number of sites can check and tell you if you do. And so if you do have IPv6, then you're good to go, and you can skip ahead to the connecting to your instance part of the video. And if you don't have IPv6 access, then there are two solutions, which we'll go over those next. So the preferred solution to not having IPv6 access is to connect to your instance through the Rapid Access Cloud VPN. So depending on what type of machine you're running, the steps to do this will be slightly different, but the process is pretty much the same. And they're all outlined on the tutorial slides, so you should be able to follow along with them. But since I'm running a Mac, I'll just go ahead and go through those steps with you now. So the first thing that we need is some sort of VPN application. And so for Mac, Cybera recommends to use TunnelBlick, so you can go ahead and download that program and install it onto your machine. And the next step is to download the VPN configuration files that they provide for you. So I'll go ahead and download the Edmonton files. Then I can go ahead and unzip those. And then by double-clicking it, it should automatically open up the TunnelBlick program. And if it doesn't, you can just open it. And you should see the new VPN for YEG configuration files here. And so go ahead and click that, and then connect, at which point it's going to ask you for your Cybera Rapid Access Cloud username and password. And so you can go ahead and enter those to log in. After you successfully enter your username and password, you should see that you're now connected to the VPN here. For Mac, you might see a warning or a message that says that your computer's IP address is not different after connecting to the VPN. You can safely ignore that message and just continue on. So the next step that we're going to do is just double check that we are connected to the VPN gateway by pinging the VPN gateway IP address that the Cybera has provided us. So to do that, we can just open a terminal and ping 10.254.0.1 to can see that we're successfully sending the pings, so we are connected. And then we'll also check that we are able to ping the IP address of our instance. So we'll do that in the same way by entering the IPv4 address that's associated with our instance. Again, you can see that we are successfully sending the pings. And so now we can actually connect to our instance. Okay, so now we should all have either IPv6 access, be connected to the Cybera VPN, or have been allocated a floating IP. So the last step is to actually connect to our instance, which we can do through SSH. So we'll open up a new terminal and type SSH, and then use the -I command line option. And this allows us to specify the private key that we'll use for authentication. And so I'll enter the path to the key that I created earlier. And then to connect to our instance, we'll want to specify the username and the IP address of that instance. So for the Ubuntu images, the default username is just Ubuntu. And we'll type the @ and then enter the IP address. And so if you have IPv6 access, you can just enter the default IPv6 address that came with your instance. If you're connected to the VPN, then you just enter the default private IPv4 address that was provided. And if you were allocated a floating IP, you would use the floating IP address that should show up somewhere down here. So I'll go ahead and copy my IPv6 address and then enter it in the terminal, and then press enter to connect. And so as you can see, we've now connected to our instance, and we can go ahead and start working here.